It was a cold morning on January 8, 2018, when emergency services were called to a small farmhouse just outside Traverse City, Michigan. The caller was Martha Klein, a neighbor who had been checking on the elderly couple living next door, Eleanor and Thomas Whitmore, both in their late 70s. Martha's voice on the 911 tape was shaky but composed. "They're not responding. The door was unlocked. I went inside and they're both in bed. They're cold. Please, someone needs to come." When first responders arrived at 212 Lakeview Road, they found the Whitmores lying side by side in their bedroom, tucked neatly under their floral-patterned quilt. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, and nothing appeared stolen. The house was clean, almost too clean, according to one of the responding officers. To the untrained eye, it looked peaceful, a couple who had passed away in their sleep. But something about the scene felt off. The heat was running unusually high for a mild winter morning, and both bodies appeared slightly discolored, a faint bluish tint around the lips. Within hours, the Grand Traverse County medical examiner ruled that a full autopsy was necessary. The preliminary assumption was carbon monoxide poisoning, common in older homes during winter. But when investigators checked the furnace, they found it was in perfect working order. Then came the first red flag. On the kitchen counter, officers noticed 2 mugs of tea, half-finished, with residue that glistened under the light. Inside the sink was a 3rd mug, rinsed but not washed. Detectives bagged them for testing. At that moment, no one suspected foul play, not yet. But when the toxicology results came back a week later, the results stunned everyone. Ethylene glycol, a main component of antifreeze, was present in both victims' systems at lethal levels. The Whitmores hadn't died of natural causes. They had been poisoned. And the person responsible wasn't a stranger. It was someone they trusted, someone who had the keys to their home, access to their medicine, and who had been caring for them for months. Her name was Janice Pruitt. Eleanor and Thomas Whitmore were not the kind of couple that drew much attention. By all accounts, they had lived a quiet, steady life, the kind that seldom made headlines until tragedy found them. They had been married for 53 years. Thomas, a retired postmaster, was known in Traverse City for his punctuality and dry humor. Eleanor, a former elementary school teacher, was remembered by her former students as the one who always brought cookies on Fridays. The two had no children, a quiet sadness that those close to them said they carried with grace. Instead, their world revolved around their small circle of neighbors, their church community, and their garden, a modest plot behind their farmhouse that produced more tomatoes than they could ever eat. Their days followed an easy rhythm. Morning walks around the property, coffee on the porch, evenings spent watching old movies. They had been aging gracefully, though Thomas's arthritis had worsened over the last few years, and Eleanor's memory had begun to slip. By 2017, Eleanor's mild forgetfulness had progressed into early-stage dementia. It wasn't severe, but enough to make daily tasks, managing medication, paying bills, cooking, more difficult. Their friends had grown worried, but the Whitmores were proud, reluctant to accept help. That changed in April 2017, when Eleanor tripped while feeding the birds and fractured her hip. The recovery was long and slow, and Thomas, despite his age, tried to handle everything himself. He cooked, cleaned, drove to appointments. But his joints made even small chores painful. That's when Janice Pruitt entered their lives. She came highly recommended by a member of their church. A licensed home caregiver with nearly a decade of experience, Janice was said to be patient, gentle, and a godsend for elderly clients. She lived just 10 miles away, in a small apartment above a bakery. At first, she was everything the Whitmores could have asked for. She started with 3-hour visits, helping with errands and light cleaning. Soon, she was spending entire days with them, cooking meals, organizing medications, driving them to appointments. Eleanor, despite her memory lapses, grew fond of her. "Janice is my angel," she reportedly told her neighbor, Martha Klein. By the fall of 2017, Janice had become more than an employee. She was part of the household. She had a set of keys, full access to their home and control over most of their routines. Thomas began referring to her as family. But subtle changes followed, things no one thought much about at the time. The Whitmores stopped attending Sunday service. They rarely accepted visitors. When neighbors called, Janice usually answered, explaining that the couple was resting or not feeling up to company. Bank statements later showed that small withdrawals, $40 here, $60 there, began appearing around this same period. Nothing large enough to raise alarms, but steady and consistent. By Christmas, Eleanor had lost noticeable weight. Her doctor noted her confusion had worsened, but her blood work came back normal. Janice told him Eleanor wasn't eating much. Old age, she said. Thomas grew quiet. To Martha, the neighbor who would later find them, he had once joked, "If I disappear one day, it'll be because Janice locked me in the pantry." She thought he was being playful. But looking back, everyone realized the signs were there. They just hadn't known what to see. By January 2018, Janice was spending nights at the house, claiming the couple needed constant supervision. No one objected. After all, she had earned their trust. When the Whitmores were found dead a week later, the town mourned what they thought was a peaceful ending to a long life. It would take only a few days before that illusion shattered, when investigators began piecing together how their final weeks unfolded. When investigators first spoke to Janice Pruitt, she appeared calm, almost relieved to have someone to talk to. She told them she had been caring for Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore for nearly a year and had grown to love them like family. She explained that she'd stopped by the morning of January 8th to check in, only to find them unresponsive in bed. In her statement, she insisted that their deaths were peaceful, saying softly, "They were tired. They didn't want to keep fighting." The tone was steady, the kind of practiced calm that sounded sincere on the surface, but something about the phrasing unsettled the detectives in the room. Janice was 46 years old, a licensed home caregiver who'd been working with elderly clients for most of her adult life. She had grown up in northern Michigan, the eldest of 3 siblings, and had spent her 20s working as a certified nursing assistant. Her employment history was scattered: short-term jobs at nursing homes, home health agencies, and private contracts that ended abruptly for reasons never clearly documented. On paper, she looked reliable. In reality, she had struggled to keep steady work for years. Financially, Janice was drowning. Records later showed she had filed for bankruptcy twice in the previous decade. She lived alone in a small apartment above a bakery in downtown Traverse City and was several months behind rent. In late 2016, she'd started dating a mechanic named Keith Danner, a man with a minor criminal record and a reputation for drinking. The relationship was turbulent and filled with arguments about money. Text messages retrieved later would show that in the months leading up to the Whitmores' deaths, Janice had been under immense financial strain. In one message to Keith from November 2017, she wrote, "Once this old couple signs the papers, we'll be fine. I'll finally have a little breathing room." Investigators would later discover those papers referred to a power of attorney form granting Janice limited control over the Whitmores' financial and medical affairs. It wasn't illegal, but it gave her direct access to their accounts, something Thomas Whitmore's signature on the document would later prove to be forged. At first, no one thought to question her. She attended the funeral, comforted neighbors, and spoke to a local reporter about how much the couple had meant to her. "They were like my parents," she said tearfully. "They died together, just like they lived, peaceful and loving." It was the kind of soundbite that made evening news, and many in the community saw her as a grieving caregiver unfairly caught in a tragedy she couldn't prevent. But the facade began to crack 2 days after the funeral, when Janice walked into a local bank with a check made out to her for $3,200, signed in shaky handwriting by Thomas Whitmore. The date on the check was January 6th, 2 days before his death. And the memo line read, "Thank you for everything." The teller, who had handled the Whitmores' accounts for years, found the signature suspicious and contacted authorities. When asked about it, Janice claimed Thomas had written it himself as a gesture of gratitude. But neighbors later confirmed that Thomas hadn't been writing much at all in the weeks before his death due to worsening arthritis in his hands. Detectives began digging into Janice's recent purchases and found that in early December, she had bought 3 bottles of antifreeze from an auto shop on the east side of town. The cashier remembered her because she didn't seem to know what type she needed. Around the same time, her search history showed repeated queries like antifreeze poisoning symptoms and how long does ethylene glycol stay in the body. When asked about the purchases, Janice claimed she'd used the antifreeze to prevent ice from forming on the Whitmores' porch steps. A strange explanation given that the winter had been unusually mild and the couple's walkway was covered by an awning. Detectives obtained a search warrant for her apartment. What they found only deepened their suspicions. Beneath the kitchen sink sat a half-empty bottle of the same brand of antifreeze found in the Whitmores' garage. In a drawer beside her bed was a notebook containing scribbled notes about medication dosages and cryptic reminders like "keep dosage low" and "don't mix too soon." In her trash bin, they found torn pieces of what appeared to be practice signatures of Thomas Whitmore's name. When confronted with this evidence in a second interview, Janice's composure broke. She shifted from calm to defensive, insisting that the police were trying to frame her. "You don't understand," she said. "They were dying already. I just helped them stay comfortable." It was the first time she hinted at something resembling an admission, though she quickly retracted it when pressed. On February 10, 2018, officers returned to her apartment with an arrest warrant. Neighbors watched as Janice was led out in handcuffs, her expression blank and unreadable. Reporters gathered at the scene, asking if she had anything to say. She paused briefly before replying, "I didn't kill anyone. I took care of them when no one else would." By that point, the evidence spoke louder than her denial. The gentle, attentive caretaker the community once praised had become the prime suspect in a crime that shocked everyone who thought they knew her. What had begun as an act of trust, a vulnerable couple welcoming help into their home, had ended with betrayal so quiet, so methodical, that no one saw it until it was far too late. When news of Janice Pruitt's arrest spread through Traverse City, disbelief rippled across the quiet town like a shockwave. The Whitmores had been well known, if not prominent, regulars at church, kind to neighbors, always willing to lend a hand. For many, their deaths had been tragic but peaceful, a sad end to a long life. The revelation that they had been poisoned by the very person hired to care for them felt almost unthinkable. Local headlines read, "Trusted caregiver charged in elderly couple's deaths," and "Poison in a teacup, Traverse City murder case widens." Neighbors gathered in driveways and diners to talk about it. Some defended Janice at first, insisting she couldn't have done it. "She was kind, you know," one neighbor told a reporter. "You'd see her helping Thomas out of the car, always with that soft voice. I just can't imagine her doing something so awful." Others weren't as forgiving. A few admitted they had felt something off about her. The way she would step in to answer for the Whitmores when people tried to visit, or how she had slowly isolated them from everyone else. The small church the couple attended held a candlelight vigil that week. The pastor spoke about trust misplaced and the quiet dangers of dependency. The words hung heavy in the cold air. Many who had elderly parents or grandparents in care began looking at their own arrangements differently, suddenly cautious of the people they had trusted. The idea that kindness could mask such cruelty left a permanent scar on the town's sense of safety. Meanwhile, investigators continued piecing together Janice's life in the months before the murders. Surveillance footage from local stores showed her buying groceries, medication, and the antifreeze on 3 separate occasions. Financial records revealed that she had quietly transferred several $100s from the Whitmores' accounts into her own, just enough to avoid attention, but consistent enough to form a pattern. Detectives also found that she had inquired about insurance policies, asking a friend who worked at an agency if she knew whether caregivers ever qualify for beneficiary status. The friend brushed it off at the time, not realizing what she meant. The more police uncovered, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't an act of mercy or momentary lapse. It was slow, deliberate exploitation, poison administered over time under the guise of care. Interviews with medical staff confirmed that both victims had shown signs of ethylene glycol poisoning in their final weeks: fatigue, confusion, slurred speech, but each symptom had been dismissed as a sign of age or medication side effects. Janice had been the one managing their pills, preparing their meals, and brewing their tea. Every opportunity to intervene had passed through her hands first. The case became a regional media obsession. Local news vans parked outside the courthouse, and reporters dug into every part of Janice's past. Former clients came forward with small complaints, missing jewelry, misplaced checks, but no one had ever suspected criminal intent. One elderly woman recalled feeling unusually tired during the time Janice worked for her, though no medical records could confirm anything more. By early spring, Janice's defense attorney began shaping her narrative. They would argue that the deaths were assisted suicides, an act of compassion misunderstood by investigators. Her lawyer suggested that the Whitmores had grown despondent, that they had asked for help to end things on their own terms. But detectives had already reviewed every document, every note, every recording. There was no evidence of such intent, no letters, no messages, no trace of consent. What there was, however, was a steady trail of deception, money troubles, and calculated control. For Traverse City, the case wasn't just about two victims. It was about broken trust. People who had once opened their doors freely now locked them early. Neighbors stopped leaving spare keys with caretakers. The idea that someone could kill with patience, with tea and soft words, lingered long after the headlines faded. By summer, the case moved toward trial. Prosecutors had built a detailed timeline: purchases, forged documents, toxicology reports, and testimony from medical professionals. The community that once pitied Janice now turned away from her. At the county courthouse, protesters held signs that read, "Justice for the Whitmores" and "Protect our seniors." Inside the jail, Janice kept to herself, rarely speaking except to her attorney. Those who saw her said she looked smaller somehow, her quiet composure replaced by a kind of restless emptiness. When the trial finally began in November 2018, the courtroom was filled to capacity. Family friends sat shoulder to shoulder in the gallery, listening as prosecutors described how antifreeze had been slowly mixed into the couple's tea and soup over the course of several weeks. They played recorded interviews, displayed the receipts, and read aloud excerpts from Janice's notebook. The jury sat still, their faces unreadable. It wasn't the kind of case that relied on emotion. It was built on patience and precision, much like the crime itself. The defense tried to humanize her. They spoke of her difficult childhood, her financial struggles, her years of service to others. They suggested loneliness had clouded her judgment, that she had been under emotional strain. But when the prosecutor held up the photographs of the mugs found on the Whitmore's kitchen counter and described how the poison had settled at the bottom, the room fell silent. There was no justification that could undo the cruelty of it. After 8 days of testimony and 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts. When the judge pronounced the sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, Janice blinked once, stared down at her hands, and said nothing. The courtroom was utterly still, save for the quiet sob of a neighbor in the back row. In the months that followed, the town tried to move on, though traces of the case remained everywhere. The Whitmore home sat empty for nearly 2 years before it was sold. People avoided walking past it at night, even after the new owners moved in. The church pew where Eleanor had always sat stayed unoccupied, as if held in silent remembrance. And each winter, when the air turned sharp and the days shortened, people would think back to that cold morning on Lakeview Road when a simple call for help uncovered something far darker than anyone could have imagined. For the investigators who worked the case, the question that lingered was not how Janice did it. They knew that part. But why? Some believed it was greed. Others thought it was a twisted need for control. Perhaps, they said, it was a kind of resentment born from years of caring for people who had what she never did: stability, companionship, and peace. Whatever her reasons, the result was the same: 2 gentle lives taken quietly, 1 cup of tea at a time, by a woman who called herself their angel. And long after her sentencing, when asked in a rare prison interview whether she regretted what she had done, Janice Pruitt simply said, "I gave them an ending. I just wish people could understand that." But no one did. Not then, and not now. The years that followed the trial were quieter, but the echoes of what had happened never truly left Traverse City. Reporters occasionally revisited the story on anniversaries, usually under headlines about elder care reform or warning signs of financial abuse. Each time her name appeared again, people would remember that calm, ordinary woman who had once moved so easily among them, chatting at the grocery store, helping her clients into church pews, and how none of them had seen what she was capable of. Janice Pruitt began serving her sentence at the Huron Valley Correctional Facility for Women in Ypsilanti, Michigan. She was assigned to the prison infirmary because of her background in nursing assistance. Those who worked alongside her said she followed rules to the letter, rarely spoke about her case, and kept her space impeccably clean. In interviews for a later documentary, a former corrections officer described her as polite, detached, like she'd built a wall inside herself and decided to live behind it. She never admitted guilt, but she never protested her innocence anymore either. When someone mentioned the Whitmores by name, she would nod once and say, "I hope they're at peace." Back in Traverse City, the community changed in small but lasting ways. The county sheriff's office launched a program to vet private caregivers more thoroughly. Local churches began hosting informational sessions on elder abuse prevention, teaching families how to monitor finances, prescriptions, and home visits. A memorial garden was planted near the town library in honor of Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore, 2 benches, a plaque, and rows of white lilies that bloom each summer. Every June, on the anniversary of their deaths, Martha Klein brings fresh flowers from her yard and sits quietly for a while. "I still hear them sometimes," she once told a reporter. "Eleanor's laugh through the window, Tom calling out about the weather. Some people just stay with you." The Whitmores' extended relatives, who had lived out of state, eventually settled their estate. Most of what they left behind was donated to the local school district and senior center. Their farmhouse on Lakeview Road changed hands twice before being remodeled by a young family. The new owners said they didn't mind the story. They liked the house's warmth, its view of the trees. Still, some neighbors say that on winter mornings, when the frost settles just right, the light from the kitchen window looks eerily like it did that day, the soft glow that never went out. The case also found its way into academic circles, cited in criminology courses as an example of caretaker homicide, a rare but growing category of crime where dependency and control blur into lethal power. Psychologists who reviewed Janice's background concluded she exhibited traits of what's sometimes called covert narcissism, a need to feel indispensable paired with deep resentment toward those who depend on her. The more the Whitmores trusted her, they argued, the more she needed to assert dominance, until compassion and cruelty became indistinguishable. When asked about her motives during a recorded interview in 2021, Janice paused a long time before answering. "People think it was about money," she said quietly. "It wasn't. I just couldn't watch them fall apart. Every day, a little more of them was gone. Maybe I wanted to stop it. Maybe I wanted to stop me from having to see it." She gave a faint smile. "They loved me, right up to the end." The interviewer didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. For those who investigated the crime, the Whitmore case became a permanent marker in their careers. Detective Sarah Holbrook, now retired, said it changed the way she looked at ordinary kindness. "You think danger comes loud," she told a documentary crew. "Guns, shouting, fights. But this was quiet. It came in with groceries and left behind teacups. That's what stays with me." In the end, the story of Janice Pruitt and the Whitmores is less about mystery than about trust. The slow erosion of it, the blindness that comes with gratitude, and the danger of loneliness left unchecked. The Whitmores weren't foolish. They were kind. They believed goodness could be seen in how someone carried themselves, how they spoke softly and remembered small things. They believed that trust, once given, was safe. But in that small farmhouse on Lakeview Road, trust became a weapon. Each cup of tea, each gentle reminder to take medicine, each comforting word was part of a pattern that only made sense when it was too late. The life sentence that followed could never balance the scale, because what was lost was not just 2 lives, it was a community's sense of innocence. Years later, the case still circulates on true crime forums and late-night podcasts. Listeners always ask the same question: how could someone capable of care also be capable of such quiet destruction? There's never a satisfying answer, only the uneasy realization that the line between kindness and control can be impossibly thin. And so the story ends the way it began, in silence. A cold Michigan morning, a quiet house, and a truth that came too late. The Whitmores rest beneath a shared headstone engraved with the words, "Together, always." Their names, simple and unadorned, face the same rising sun that once lit their kitchen window. Somewhere, in a prison hundreds of miles away, the woman who ended their lives wakes before dawn and begins her shift in the infirmary, moving through the same motions of care that once made her indispensable. Nothing looks different now. The routines, the calm, the soft tone. But everyone who knows her story understands what those gestures can hide. The danger, as Detective Holbrook once said, doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes with a smile, a steady hand, and a cup of tea. In the years that followed, the Whitmore case faded from national headlines, but in Traverse City, its shadow lingered like fog over the lake. Residents began locking doors earlier, checking on their elderly parents more often, and second-guessing every too friendly smile. For a place that once prided itself on neighborly trust, the story left a small but permanent crack in the town's sense of safety. A few years after the verdict, a local journalism student named Emma Dunn began researching the case for her graduate thesis. She was only 12 when the murders happened, but she remembered the whispers, the police cars on Lakeview Road, the sudden quiet that fell over the community. Emma spent months reading old court transcripts, watching archived news segments, and interviewing anyone willing to talk. What she found wasn't a single story of greed or madness, but a series of moments where empathy turned inward, where help became harm without anyone noticing. She discovered that Janice's early years had been marked by quiet instability. A father who abandoned the family, a mother who cycled through jobs and illnesses, and a young girl who learned early that love often came as a transaction. Teachers described her as diligent but withdrawn. Co-workers later said she was dependable to a fault, always volunteering for extra shifts, always showing up even when sick. Yet, as Emma noted in her paper, dependability without boundaries can become a cage, and sometimes the only way out is control. Emma's research also uncovered something no one had paid much attention to during the trial. In Janice's notebooks, seized during the investigation, there were dozens of lists. Shopping lists, to-do lists, daily care schedules for the Whitmores. But tucked between them were short, almost diary-like entries, each one a sentence or two, written in neat, slanted handwriting. Most were mundane. Eleanor slept better today. Tom smiled when I read him the paper. But a few stood out. They wouldn't last without me. It's mercy if I help them go peacefully. The last entry, written 3 days before the murders, read simply, "When you give everything, there's nothing left to take." No one ever determined whether the killings were spontaneous or planned. Prosecutors called it calculated. Her defense argued it an emotional collapse. But looking at those pages, Emma concluded that both were true. That Janice's decision had grown slowly, quietly, like a shadow extending over time. It wasn't one night of madness. It was the final act of a long, unseen unraveling. Janice never saw Emma's work. By the time the thesis was published online in 2027, she was in her late 50s and had been transferred to a lower security facility for good behavior. A local news outlet ran a short feature on her adjustment to prison life. She led a group therapy circle for aging inmates, taught basic nursing skills, and maintained a small vegetable garden in the yard. When asked if she'd read anything about her case recently, she said only, "People tell the story how they need to. I've told mine to God, and that's enough." Eleanor and Thomas Whitmore's niece, Margaret Chen, spoke briefly in that same report. She said she didn't forgive Janice, but she'd stopped hating her. "Forgiveness isn't for her," Margaret said. "It's for the rest of us, so we can stop wondering what we missed." Today, the farmhouse on Lakeview Road still stands, its exterior freshly painted and its garden replanted. The new family who lives there says they sometimes receive mail addressed to the Whitmores, charity newsletters, holiday cards from old friends who never heard the news. They keep them all in a small wooden box, planning to pass it along someday to the local museum that holds the Whitmore archives. "We don't feel haunted," the new homeowner said in an interview. "We feel like we're part of keeping their story alive, just in a gentler way." Every few years, someone discovers the case again, usually a true crime podcast or YouTube documentary, presenting it as the Caretaker Murders of Lakeview Road. The narrator speaks softly, the piano music fades under the retelling, and somewhere between sympathy and horror, listeners feel that cold recognition, the realization that monsters aren't always strangers in the dark. Sometimes they come in daylight, wearing scrubs and offering comfort. There are no cinematic endings in stories like these, no redemption, no neat moral. There's only a pattern repeated in quiet towns everywhere. Trust offered, trust betrayed, lives quietly rewritten. The Whitmore story endures not because of the crime itself, but because of what it reveals about human fragility. The way care can blur into possession, and love, when twisted by loneliness, can become lethal. And so, the story of Janice Pruitt remains exactly what it always was. An ordinary tragedy. A woman who wanted to be needed, a couple who believed in kindness, a town that learned too late that even gentle hands can do harm. There's no twist, no secret revelation, only the silence that follows when everything you thought was safe proves it never truly was. In the decades since the murders, Traverse City has learned to fold the Whitmore tragedy into its history rather than around it. The story no longer dominates conversation, but it lingers. In classrooms, in community meetings, in the collective caution of a place that once prided itself on being unguarded. A small local podcast, Northern Echoes, devoted an episode to the case on its 10th anniversary. The host, a lifelong resident, described it as a story that feels closer to a warning than a mystery. The podcast episode opened with a recording of the original 911 call. Derek Miles's breathless voice still sounded shaken, even all these years later. Over the crackling audio, the host said, "Every crime leaves an echo. Sometimes it's a scream. Sometimes it's silence that doesn't end." What made this story endure wasn't its brutality. It was its ordinariness. There were no headlines of stolen millions, no gruesome conspiracy, no cult, no scandal. Just a woman who wanted control over something that kept slipping away. The people who defined her worth. The police reports, still accessible in the county archive, describe the home as orderly, calm, well-maintained. There were no signs of struggle. 2 teacups were found on the table. It was, as one detective said later, a murder that looked like breakfast. Every few years, high school students in Traverse City are assigned to read about the case in a criminal justice elective. They're asked to write essays about motive, empathy, and how trust is built or broken. One essay, archived online, stands out. It reads, "Janice Pruitt didn't wake up evil. She woke up tired. Tired of being invisible, tired of waiting for something to change. And when you mistake being needed for being loved, that tiredness turns into something dangerous." When the county finally digitized all the court records in 2030, one image resurfaced. A still frame from courtroom footage showing Janice on the day of sentencing. She's standing as the judge reads the verdict. Life without the possibility of parole. Her posture is straight, her face expressionless, but her hands are clasped tightly in front of her, white at the knuckles, trembling just slightly. That image, more than any headline, captures the quiet truth of the case. A woman who believed she was in control until the moment she wasn't. Eleanor and Thomas Whitmore's legacy outlived the tragedy in its own modest way. Their endowment to the local school district funded a literacy program that still operates today. A small plaque inside the elementary school library bears their names. In memory of those who believed kindness could change a life. Children pass it every day, unaware of the story behind it. To most of them, the Whitmores are simply names on a wall. Another quiet reminder of people who once gave more than they took. As for Janice, her final years remain largely undocumented. Prison records show she developed chronic health issues and was transferred to a medical facility in 2033. A brief note in the Michigan Department of Corrections database lists her date of death as April 9, 2035. No cause of death is recorded publicly. Her body was cremated, unclaimed. Detective Sarah Holbrook, long retired by then, was notified out of protocol. In an interview afterward, she said, "I didn't feel relief, just stillness, like the story finally exhaled." The Whitmores' graves remain tended. Sometimes strangers leave flowers. Sometimes just small notes with single words, like peace, mercy, forgive. No one knows who leaves them. Maybe people who saw themselves in her. Maybe those who saw their parents in the Whitmores. Or maybe just people trying to understand how something so gentle could become so irreversible. In the end, there's no neat moral to draw. The story of Janice Pruitt and the Whitmores doesn't fit into categories of good or evil. It sits somewhere in between, in that uneasy place where loneliness, duty, and control intertwine. The quiet house on Lakeview Road still stands, its windows gleaming in the morning light. If you drive by in winter, when the snow is heavy and sound carries far, you can hear nothing at all. No movement, no wind, just the steady hum of the world going on. The town learned to live with the silence. And maybe that, in the end, is all any community can do when faced with the kind of crime that doesn't shout, but whispers. It whispers that even the softest voices can hide storms. That kindness, without balance, can break. And that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is simply being needed too much. Over time, the Whitmore case became less a local tragedy and more a cultural parable. The kind of story that surfaced whenever people discussed the hidden pressures of caregiving, the ethics of dependency, or the quiet desperation that can grow behind closed doors. University professors cited it in psychology lectures. Journalists referenced it in articles about aging and isolation in rural America. Yet beneath all the analysis and commentary, the heart of the story remained painfully simple.
Three people caught in a web of need, trust, and exhaustion. In 2038, a documentary filmmaker named Leah Ross released a film titled Still Hands: The Caregiver Murders. It was part of a public television series exploring crimes committed in small towns. Leah's approach was restrained. No dramatic music, no reenactments. Just slow pans over quiet streets, photographs of the Whitmores' home, and excerpts from interviews with people who had known them. The film's power lay in its stillness. This was not a story of monsters, Leah said in voiceover. It was a story of loneliness, stretched so thin it finally tore. The film received modest attention, but struck deeply with those who watched it. Viewers wrote in letters describing how it changed the way they thought about caregiving, not as an act of unending devotion, but one that must coexist with boundaries, respite, and recognition. Leah later said she hoped the documentary would serve as a mirror, reflecting how quietly people can lose themselves in trying to be everything to someone else.
At the Traverse City Public Library, a copy of Still Hands sits on a shelf beside other local history materials. Once a year, around the anniversary of the Whitmore murders, a discussion group gathers in the community room. They watch sections of the film, then talk, not about guilt or evil, but about the ordinary cracks that can lead to extraordinary harm. One year, a retired nurse stood up and said softly, "We forget that caregivers need care too. That's the part no one teaches you." Outside the library, the memorial garden still blooms. The lilies have spread wider than expected, and the benches are worn smooth by time and weather. Passers-by sometimes stop to read the plaque or sit for a few quiet minutes. The air there feels strangely calm, not haunted, but settled, as if the town has finally learned to hold the memory without flinching. Some nights, a soft orange light still glows from the farmhouse kitchen window, the same window where everything ended. The new family that lives there says it's comforting, that they like how the house feels alive. Maybe that's how it should be. The story began with silence, and it ends with life continuing quietly in the same place where it once stopped. The Whitmore story has become more than a cautionary tale. It's a reminder about how dependence can blur into control, how kindness can be taken too far, how isolation can reshape even the gentlest heart. Most of all, it's a reflection on the fragility of ordinary goodness, the kind that assumes safety simply because danger looks like something louder. If you visit Lakeview Road today, you might not even notice the house. It looks like any other. Children's toys in the yard, wind chimes by the porch, a soft hum of a life well lived. But those who know the story say that's what makes it unsettling. Because every house that looks peaceful from the outside holds its own history. And sometimes what's hidden isn't darkness, but the quiet aftermath of love gone terribly wrong. And as the documentary's final words fade over the image of the Whitmore's headstone, Leah's voice returns one last time. Evil doesn't always come with fury. Sometimes it comes with devotion and a cup of tea. Years later, long after the documentaries had stopped airing and the news articles had faded into digital archives, the story of the Whitmores and Janice Pruitt lived on quietly, not through sensational headlines, but through whispers, lessons, and memory. Traverse City had changed, like all towns do. New families moved in, businesses came and went, and most people under 20 had only heard fragments of the story from parents or teachers. Yet the name Whitmore still carried a kind of hush with it. Not fear exactly, but respect, the way people speak about something fragile and irreversible. Every October, around the anniversary of the murders, a small group of locals would visit the memorial garden. They didn't speak much. Some brought flowers, others just sat in silence. Among them was Martha Klein, older now, her movement slower but steady. She always placed a single lily on the plaque, tracing the engraved names with her fingertips. One year, when a local journalist asked her why she still came, she smiled faintly and said, "Because some stories shouldn't disappear. Not because they're tragic, but because they remind us what happens when we stop seeing each other." By the early 2040s, Traverse City had grown into a larger hub for retirees and remote workers, drawn by its lakes and slow rhythm.
Ironically, that same demographic shift sparked new discussions about elder care, isolation, and the need for community oversight. Local nursing programs even added a case study based loosely on the Whitmore murders, reframed as the ethics of caregiving, a boundary lost. Students debated what could have been done differently, whether Janice should have been relieved of duty sooner, whether the Whitmores' relatives bore some responsibility, or whether it was simply an inevitable tragedy of human nature. But what lingered most in those discussions wasn't the crime itself. It was the quiet pattern that led up to it. The dinners where Janice stayed long after her shift ended. The small, unnoticed ways the Whitmores' world narrowed until she was the only person inside it. The slow isolation that made everything seem normal until it wasn't. Somewhere in those details lay the truth that no documentary or report could quite articulate. The trust, unchecked and unbalanced, can become a trap for everyone involved. It's not always born from malice. Sometimes it grows from devotion, the kind that refuses to let go even when it should. Janice Pruitt's story might have ended with a death certificate and a line in the prison records, but her presence lingered. Former guards said she often asked about the outside world, about the weather, the lake, and the lilacs in Traverse City. One nurse who attended to her in her final months said Janice's last words were simple: "Tell them I did love them." Whether she meant the Whitmores or something larger, perhaps humanity itself, no one could say.
When the Traverse City Historical Society curated a digital exhibit called Echoes of the North, they included a small section about the case. It wasn't the centerpiece, just a modest panel with photographs, court clippings, and a quiet message that read, "In remembering them, we remember to care better." Visitors lingered there longer than expected, reading not about the crime, but about the community that rebuilt itself afterward. Neighbors checking in on one another, local churches starting meal programs for the elderly, and a small group of volunteers who created a hotline for caregivers in emotional crisis. In that way, the story did what no trial or punishment could. It reshaped a town's conscience. The horror of the crime slowly gave way to something gentler: awareness, prevention, connection. What began with betrayal ended, slowly, with vigilance and compassion. On the 15th anniversary of the murders, the Traverse Daily ran a short editorial titled, "What We Learned from the Whitmores." It read, "We learned that danger doesn't always arrive as a stranger. We learned that care must be shared, never owned. And we learned that forgiveness, when it comes, doesn't erase, it teaches." In the final photograph accompanying that article, the Whitmore house stands beneath a pale morning sky, frost glinting on the lawn. Through the window, a warm light glows, steady, calm, familiar. The caption beneath it is simple: "Life goes on." And that, perhaps, is the truest ending. Not justice or closure or punishment, just life, quietly continuing in the same space where everything once stopped. The house on Lakeview Road, the lilies in bloom, the lake beyond reflecting the morning light. Reminders that even after silence, the world keeps breathing. The Whitmore story remains, not as a wound, but as a whisper. A quiet echo urging the living to care more carefully, to look closer, to listen before it's too late. By the 25th anniversary of the Whitmore murders, Traverse City had changed beyond recognition. The once quiet community was now a growing lakeside district filled with modern cafes, co-working spaces, and retirement villas. Most of the original residents had either moved away or passed on, and the case that had once defined the town's identity had become a footnote in its history, something recalled in passing by older locals or rediscovered by young reporters chasing nostalgia for old Traverse. A new podcast, Forgotten Files, Midwestern Mysteries, devoted a special episode to the case in 2044. The host opened with the same 911 call that had echoed through so many past retellings. Derek Miles' strained voice, the sound of his shoes scraping gravel as he described the open door on Lakeview Road. But this time, the focus wasn't on Janice's guilt or the Whitmores' deaths. It was on why the story had stayed alive. "Every small town has a secret," the host said softly. "But what makes the Whitmore case different is that everyone thought they were part of the solution. The neighbor who checked in, the church group that offered help, even the detective who stayed up nights looking for clues, they all thought kindness would be enough. It wasn't." The episode went viral briefly, shared among online communities fascinated by emotional true crime. Stories less about horror and more about humanity's breaking points. Listeners commented that the story felt too real, too close, too possible. One comment stood out among thousands. "I was a caregiver once. You don't realize how invisible you've become until someone finally sees you. And by then, you're already gone." By then, the Whitmore house was owned by a couple who had turned it into a lakeside bed and breakfast called the Larchwood Inn. They kept the name discreet, never mentioning the crime unless guests brought it up. Most didn't. The rooms smelled faintly of cedar and lemon, the kitchen gleamed, and the garden outside was full of white lilies and hydrangeas. Reviews online described it as serene, peaceful, haunted in the most human way. In one corner of the inn's parlor, beside a small bookshelf, there's a framed newspaper clipping, the original Traverse Daily headline from 2019, "Elderly couple found dead, caregiver in custody." Below it, in smaller text, the owners added a handwritten note. "In memory of those who remind us that care is sacred and fragile." Guests often paused to read it, not realizing the depth of its meaning. The owners said they kept it there not as a morbid decoration, but as a quiet acknowledgement, a way to let the house speak for itself. Every so often, someone would leave a letter under the door addressed simply to Janice. Some were angry, some were forgiving, and some were just confused. "I think you lost yourself in love," one read. "I hope you found peace." The owners never opened them. They placed each envelope in a small wooden box in the attic, the same way the new residents decades earlier had stored old letters for the Whitmores. It's said that on cold mornings, when mist drifts in from the lake, the inn's windows glow with a soft amber light that looks almost like candle flame. Travelers walking by sometimes stop to look, unsure why it feels so familiar. Maybe it's because, in that stillness, the house seems to remember, not the violence, but the quiet that came before it. For the people of Traverse City, the Whitmore story no longer feels like a tragedy to retell, but a lesson, quietly absorbed. It's taught them that evil doesn't always scream, that love isn't always gentle, and that even good intentions can rot when they stand alone too long. The last public reference to the case came in 2049, when the Michigan Review published an anniversary essay titled "The Quiet Kind: How One Case Redefined Trust in Small-Town America." It ended with a single paragraph that summed up what had taken decades to understand. The Whitmores believed kindness could save them. Janice believed love meant never letting go. And the town learned, in the space between them, that mercy without boundaries can destroy everything it touches. Now, the Whitmore story belongs to the wind that moves through the birch trees on Lakeview Road, still there, still whispering, but softer each year. The light in the window burns on, steady and warm, and the lilies bloom faithfully every spring. No one speaks of guilt anymore, only remembrance. And the house, at last, is quiet again.